diplomacy in the pursuit of international peace. Our vision is a world where peace is the norm and war the exception. So as we all know, the tragic war in Ukraine continues to escalate, with all its suffering for civilians and all the heartrending TV visuals that we're all watching on the hundreds of thousands of refugees that are making their way to neighboring countries. But yesterday, we saw a particularly ominous development when Russia placed its nuclear forces on high alert. We seem to be entering a spiral of escalation after Russia's invasion, a spiral that has revived in our time the specter of nuclear war. So this crisis also comes at an interesting moment for the Biden administration, because it is preparing to release in weeks, perhaps days, its nuclear posture review, which is a major policy document that will propose the next phase of America's policy on nuclear weapons. So to discuss the nuclear posture review, but especially in the light of the crisis with Russia that seems to be escalating, we have today a very distinguished panel. And this panel is going to talk about where US nuclear policy is going and where it should go. This is in the context of a brand new brief that Quincy Institute has just published, authored by Joe Cirincione, who is present in the panel today. The brief is titled, Achieving a Safer US Nuclear Posture. And we also have two other distinguished guests to join our panel, but let me start by introducing Joe Cirincione himself. Welcome to the event, Joe.
Thank you very much.
Joe, you are a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute. You have served previously as president of Plowshares Fund, which is a global security foundation, vice president for national security at the Center for American Progress, and director for Non-Proliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, among other many positions. You are also a member of the staff of the House Armed Services Committee and the Government Operations Committee. And you have also served on the International Security Advisory Board for Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. And you are also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And in addition to all that, you authored 7 books. So that's a lot. And I have edited this description. So there's a lot there that you're bringing here.
I had trouble holding down a job.
We also have 2 other equally distinguished panelists to join us. Our second panelist is Christopher Preble. He is co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. His own work focuses on the history of US foreign policy and grand strategy, military force posture, and alliance relations, among many other things. Preble is the author of 4 books. His work has appeared in major publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times. He teaches at the University of California, Washington Center, and was previously vice president at the Cato Institute, as well as a commissioned officer in the US Navy. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you, Sharon. Good to be here.
And finally, we have our third distinguished panelist, Sharon K Weiner, who is an associate professor in the School of International Service at American University, where her research focuses on nuclear weapons, civil-military relations, and international security. She is currently on leave and serving for 2 years as Senior Resident Fellow with the Carnegie Corporation of New York. She is here today in her personal capacity. And Sharon, you also hold a PhD in political science from MIT. So welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start with you directly, Sharon, and try to take it from there. So obviously the introduction of this overt nuclear dimension has worsened what is already quite a serious U.S. Russia crisis. Bilateral relations are at arguably their worst since the early 80s, if not prior. How could this nuclear situation escalate from here on? Could you lay us out a potential scenario for this? And how does the United States de-escalate from here?
Sure. So first of all, Sarang, thank you very much. And also to the Quincy Institute for hosting this important discussion. Let me also reiterate that I'm here today in my personal capacity and that my comments do not necessarily reflect the views of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So to get to the question about nuclear escalation crises, as I'm sure everyone listening has read in the newspapers, Russia has done some variety of putting their nuclear weapons on alert. So the first thing would be, well, on alert can mean lots of different things. And so at this point, it's not clear exactly what Putin meant by putting weapons on alert. So I think it's important not to impose a precise meaning on something that's actually ambiguous and is still in the process of we're trying to understand it, because I think implying precision might make the situation more dangerous. But I think the Biden administration got it right. Don't escalate in response. It's really hard to see how a competition in risk-taking and reckless behavior really benefits anyone at this point. And so opting out and saying, we're not going to match you, I think was the right call. But with respect to the NPR, I actually think the Biden administration can go further than this. So as it's finalizing or reconsidering the last bits of the NPR, if the NPR continues to endorse the development of low-yield nuclear weapons, it really needs to explain how it examined the requirements for escalation control, the requirements for brinksmanship, and also the requirements for competitive risk-taking, because these are all things that low-yield nuclear weapons play a part in. So what's the administration's rationale that limited goals are worth the danger of total nuclear war? That's something I think the NPR should address, especially as it relates to low-yield weapons. I'd suggest this problem really has become more acute, but it was prior to Putin's current actions. So my understanding, for example, is that the regional combatant commanders, people who are normally in charge of conventional conflicts, can now consider nuclear weapons as part of their force planning. And if that's the case, this conventional nuclear integration is really it's a slippery slope, and it makes nuclear weapons use more likely. So if this is the case, the NPR needs to explain why it's justified and why the president is certain that escalation can be controlled or managed in the way that is envisioned and that informed the choices made in the nuclear posture review.
Right. Thanks for that. Joe, can you pick up on some of Sharon's points and talk a little bit about the Russia crisis? How much should we be worried about this high alert status, and where does this go from here, and what can we do to tamp it down?
Sure. If you are worried about Putin's statements and actions over the last few days, you're having a rational response to this crisis. The risk of nuclear use is low, but it is not zero. And that should terrify us. And what you've seen from the very beginning is Putin integrating nuclear weapons into his invasion plans. He exercised 7 different types of nuclear capable weapons in the exercises leading up to this invasion. He cited falsely Ukraine's supposed development of nuclear weapons as one of the justifications that required urgent action, as he said, echoing basically George W. Bush in the 2003 war, or what some people say about Iran these days, equally false. He then made explicit threats twice, and then yesterday he raised the alert level. As Sharon says, we don't quite know what this is, but I pay a lot of attention to Pavel Podrick, who explains clearly in several tweets and in several articles that what we're basically doing is coming from the day-to-day alert status to the elevated status, the second of four possible statuses, where you basically have unlocked the command and control system. In their normal day-to-day operations, these weapons, the command and control system cannot transmit a launch order. It's a safety mechanism. What you've now done is unlock that and basically take the safety off the nuclear gun. So now a launch order can be transmitted. So we don't know that for sure, but that's most likely what's going on right now. And Sharon hits on the key point. Both the United States and Russia have in recent decades developed this concept of integrated deterrence. If we get a nuclear posture review, you're going to see the Biden administration promoting this view. After the Cold War, many of us thought that nuclear weapons were obsolete. We no longer needed them. We had dodged the bullet. We could get rid of them. Well, the people who make and promote and field these nuclear weapons thought that this was too valuable an asset to give up, and they looked for ways to bring them into war plans because they've basically been isolated over by the side, vulnerable to budget cuts, vulnerable to troop reductions, et cetera. And this concept of integrated deterrence says that there's a continuum between all your coercive tools: economic sanctions, conventional war, cyber war, nuclear war. This is intended to strengthen deterrence, to convince a foe that they shouldn't engage at a low level of conflict because you could prevail at this higher level of conflict. But there's a slippery slope here. As Sharon says, once you get into the conflict, the barriers to escalation are reduced. And you could very easily see a situation, especially if Putin is losing this war, something that most of us thought was inconceivable 4 days ago. If Putin is losing this war, he has a lot of incentives to escalate. And so ironically, Putin's defeat raises the risk of nuclear use more than Putin's victory.
So, Chris, address this question of A, that there is a serious escalation risk here, and B, that, of course, this is coming from a very dangerous and aggressive foreign leader. That's what started this nuclear dimension. But there's also something risky in the way the U.S. has set up its own nuclear policies when confronted with this kind of a situation. Where would you stand on that?
Well, I think, as I'm a historian, and so, the benefit, one of the small benefits of crises like these is it reminds people to go back and look at some of our the relevant cases. And I think, the Cuban Missile Crisis is certainly one of the most, if not the most serious crisis of the Cold War era. And in many respects, the parallels to that, and here again, I agree with something Joe said, is the opportunities for diplomacy shrink or narrow as you move from into an actual shooting war. And so again, the actual incidents of U.S. and Soviet forces coming into direct contact with one another around Cuba were small. They were fortunately did not escalate, but now because Putin has made the decision to initiate the war, some of those off ramps that were available to him, that had been made available to him, he chose not to take them. And so, but that does not mean that there aren't other off ramps for him, and identifying those along the way is important, making sure that he is aware that there are alternatives to escalation. And I think that's really the stage we're in right now, because there will be multiple opportunities still for him to escalate this conflict. As he does so, I think there are reasonable questions to ask, especially when you're talking about nuclear weapons. If he gives certain orders, will those orders be executed? Again, we know some examples from the Cold War where, thankfully, fears of a false launch warning were effectively ignored by the operators because they did not wish to bring about the end of the earth. And so but that's a pretty weak reed to hang the security of the world on. And so I think that continuing to explore opportunities for de-escalation, even in the midst of a shooting war, and not in any way excusing the fact that Vladimir Putin chose this war. He was the one who initiated this conflict. We need to be crystal clear on that. And I think here one of the differences that is relevant to some of the crises of the Cold War is the role of partners and allies in shaping this ongoing confrontation. You see the instruments of economic power, diplomatic pressure, even moral suasion, all at play right now. Everything from the very, very severe and some would argue appropriately so economic sanctions that are putting just enormous pressure on the Russian ruble right now, all the way down to seemingly silly things like sports leagues canceling games and races and things like that. There's just a broad range of things that are happening that are putting pressure, and I'm really interested in making sure that all of those instruments are on the table, but the nuclear instrument is the one that should not be. I'll close on one last point. Joe's right. The risk of nuclear use is low, but not zero, and that should worry us greatly. And so that's why we should continue to be exploring ways to defuse this crisis, even as we're in the middle of it.
That's a very, very sobering thoughts from all of you. I'm going to actually now turn to the brief that Joe wrote for the Quincy Institute, and I'm going to hold it up right here. So if you have not downloaded it still and read it, do that right after the show, because it's a really interesting brief. I love reading it. I couldn't put it down, and you wouldn't either. So I want to sort of get to this brief a little bit, and we are going to come back to the Russia point specifically again. But Joe, tell us a little bit about. I mean, you gave us a preview of the brief in your earlier answer, but can you kind of encapsulate the brief's main takeaways, its arguments for us?
Yeah, I'll thank you very much. Well, like Chris. Or I try to be like Chris. I'm an amateur historian. So there's a lot of history in this brief, and you and I, Sharon, struggled over just how much history to put in. But I think it's paying off now, because what I try to do is paint the arc. How did we get here? How did we get to a world where there are now about 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and Putin can threaten all of us with nuclear annihilation? How can that be? And we follow this arc of 77 years of the nuclear age, how they began initially purely for a deterrent weapon. The whole idea was to develop a nuclear weapon, not to use it, but to have it in case Hitler developed a nuclear weapon. And then, of course, we did use it. The arms race took off. I won't bore you, won't go through the whole history, but one of the key points that I make in the brief is at the end of the Cold War, by about 2007, there had come to be this recognition among, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, among the core of America's security elite, that we don't need these nuclear weapons. And many prominent officials stepped up to say we should eliminate them entirely. And George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn warned in 2007, if we didn't seize this moment, we would be entering into a new, more dangerous era that, in their words, would be more psychologically disorienting, more risk of nuclear use, and more economically dislocating than the Cold War itself. Well, here we are. We're in a situation where Russia still has 6,000 weapons, and we should be looking back at this history and trying to understand, how did we get here? Why didn't we seize the moment to get those nuclear weapons down to low levels, if not elimination completely. And why didn't we change our posture? Why is it that it's acceptable for Putin to threaten the first use of nuclear weapons? Why don't we have a first use policy? And what I explain, and I draw heavily on Sharon's work and that of others, is that basically the system that designs our nuclear policy is deeply flawed, deeply flawed. It is not some sober calculation of all the risks and weighing it against the cost and deep study that some people imagine. No, this is not. Whereas deep strategy might have driven our posture in the past, I actually would love to talk to Chris about how big a role strategy played in the past. Right now, you'd have to say it's just a veneer on three factors that are driving it. And the first is that some people still see nuclear weapons as an instrument of great power primacy. So this assures our role in the world. And you can see Putin feels that. And if you want to know what we think, look at what Putin is saying. He's saying what U.S. leaders think. We're an important nation. We have lots of nuclear weapons. The second is politics. People see a partisan advantage in one way or the other on nuclear weapons, but mainly using opposition to nuclear weapons to attack the Democratic Party as weak on defense. And finally, and this is the biggest driver right now, it's all about the money. All about the Benjamins, as some would say. It's contracts that drive this process. We spend about $50 billion a year on nuclear weapons, and I'll end on this. We're going to spend $634 billion on nuclear weapons this decade. That is a big market. There was a lot of money to be made in this. You got to stop thinking of these things as tools of great power dominance or defense and start thinking of them as products like tobacco or opioids or gas and oil that the companies are selling us, even though they know they could kill us, but they make money off it. And that is what driving this process. And these large contractors, I think, have a hammerlock on Pentagon policy, have a hammerlock on the key committees that approve these programs, dominate the think tank world in Washington. They've flooded think tanks with contracts to mute criticism, advertise heavily, fly bombers over sporting events. You know, they've developed this whole view of how the essential nature of nuclear weapons, spread out contracts around the country, hire an army of lobbyists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it is overwhelming. It is overwhelming. And it's profits and politics and the desire for primacy that's driving nuclear policy now, not a rational response to an external threat. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah, I'm going to actually keep you in the box just for a minute more because with apologies to my other two panelists, but I wanted to drive a little bit into that point of, you said how strategy was a driver, perhaps in the early years of nuclear policy, but now has taken backseat to these other two drivers. But could the crisis with Russia, or has the crisis with Russia already moved the strategy question up in the hierarchy, or do you see the influence of lobbies, etc., still being a predominant factor?
I think the war in Ukraine changes everything.
Right.
This is a hinge point in history. We're going to look very different on the other side of this. Look at European security. You see it changing overnight. Did you see Chancellor Schloss's speech yesterday at the Bundestag? If not, you should watch it. He just committed 100 billion euro to Germany's defense. Germany's defense budget right now is 53 billion. He just tripled it.
Right.
You know, something very profound is going on here. And for that reason, I believe President Biden should pull back the NPR. He should not issue this NPR. It was already a deeply flawed document for reasons we explained in the brief. But we got to reconsider the strategic terrain at this point. We have to learn the lessons of this. Why is it that Putin is allowed to make these kinds of threats? Why does he have these kinds of weapons? What can we do in our policy to bring in more nuclear restraints and not weaken the restraints? Instead of, as Sharon said, instead of developing weapons that could be more usable in the battlefield, instead of saying we need nuclear weapons to defend Taiwan, basically putting ourselves in the same situation as Putin is in right now, saying we will use nuclear weapons first. Let's rethink this whole thing go look back at the last 20 years and think about what we did wrong and retool it. Issuing the nuclear posture now would be a big mistake. It's going to lock in these Cold War policies for years and years. It isn't just that Biden would be approving these Cold War policies and the Trump programs and the Trump doctrine. He'd be blessing it. And everyone in his administration, all the Democrats would now have to genuflect to it. People that we know, and we know they don't think this. We know they have deep criticism of U.S. nuclear policy. That would be wiped away. They would have to support this view. It will set us back years in the effort for a safer U.S. nuclear policy. So I hope Biden pulls it back and reconsiders the strategy after the Ukraine war.
To the audience that's watching the show, I encourage you to put your questions. There's a little Q&A box there that you can put in your questions, and we're going to get to those presently. But before we get there, I sort of want to pivot to Chris here. There's a lot here. There's a lot here on the table to talk about. We don't have enough time. But Joe made a really interesting point I want to pick up on, which is Ukraine changes everything. Does it change everything, quote unquote? Also, I also want to get to your view of the deterrent, which comes a little bit more from a realist perspective. And you do think there's a role for the deterrent for the indefinite future in US policy. So try to bring those 2 points together and tell us something about what US policy should be going forward on this.
Sure, thanks. I swear that Joe and I did not coordinate these responses ahead of time, but I agree with him completely that in light
Thank you, Chris. That's fine. Sharon?
in light of what's happening with Ukraine and the ongoing crisis, that I think it would be a mistake to issue the NPR. And it is certainly not unprecedented for an administration to pull back a strategy document in light of changing circumstances. Why? Because the Biden administration, to the best of our knowledge, held back the national security strategy in light of the crisis with Russia. So we would hope that policymakers would take account of changing realities and build those into their documents. So I certainly hope that they would hold it back and try to take stock of what's happened. What has happened so far, and again, it's always perilous to comment on the future when you're in the middle of an ongoing crisis and what the implications are. But it does seem clear that other instruments of power, not just American power, but global power, that is of our partners and allies, are considerable. These other instruments are putting enormous strain on Russia and on Putin, as I've already alluded to. The comments of Chancellor Scholz, Joe is correct, are striking and at a minimum bear sort of serious consideration. There's been a tendency to sort of dismiss German claims that they are going to ramp up military spending, but what seems to be happening over the last few days is really quite remarkable. And I think that sort of calls into question on the nuclear side of the house, under what set of circumstances does the United States intend to use nuclear weapons in light of this crisis, and ask ourselves, if the United States is not prepared to use nuclear weapons in a crisis like this, and I don't think we should, and I don't think we will, what can we do to ensure that others are not tempted to use nuclear weapons in a similar fashion, right? To sort of draw this back. If the US nuclear arsenal was postured mostly for deterrence, primarily or solely for deterrence, then the force would look slightly different than it does today. And I think calling attention, especially to Joe's paper, even advocates for a strong and reliable US nuclear arsenal, military officials admit that the arsenal is larger than necessary in order for the United States to maintain a credible, capable deterrent. Many years ago now, I and my colleagues at the time, Ben Friedman at Cato and Matt Fay, published a paper on the evolution of the nuclear triad and scrutinized the rationales for maintaining a nuclear triad in the present era. And we concluded that that while the triad may have made strategic sense, and again, I emphasize may have made strategic sense when it was first imagined in the late 1950s and developed in the 1960s, it no longer withstands scrutiny on purely strategic grounds. The United States could maintain a credible deterrent deployed on only one or at most two of the three legs of the triad. If it were up to me, I would dismantle and eliminate the ICBM leg of the triad entirely. But again, that's worth debating. And I think in the end, this crisis sort of reminds us, like, what are we planning to use these weapons for? If we are not planning to use them in a crisis like this, then this is an opportunity for us to revisit the whole nuclear enterprise.
Yeah, excellent point, Chris. I reread your paper and cite it in for the brief. You don't have to change a word. It's still solid analysis. Still makes a great deal of sense.
Fantastic. Well, I want to get to Sharon now, and she was shaking her head earlier. So I want you, Sharon, to translate that head shake into words and tell us your points of difference and your points of agreement here.
Sure. So thanks. So I think that I agree in principle with what they're saying. It's just the mechanism I would change. I wouldn't delay the nuclear posture review because I think that signals that somehow Putin's actions have caused us to reconsider how we should use nuclear weapons, and that they have a greater role to play in this conflict, not a lesser role. So keep in mind, nuclear weapons are squarely within the purview of the president. So the president can always go back in and pull back. I agree with Chris, nuclear weapons for deterrence. For all of these other missions, they're exceptionally dangerous, and we have other tools. So if the president would issue the nuclear posture review now, even though we might disagree with what it's going to say, that could actually play a role in de-escalating this conflict by saying, Mr. Putin, regardless of what you've said, we have a role for nuclear weapons that doesn't involve this tit-for-tat brinksmanship with you on this particular issue. Right? So we're moving for it. And the national security strategy, fine with holding that up. But to say this changes the role that nuclear weapons plays raises a concern for me that if the NPR goes back into the bureaucracy, the requirements may change, and they may not change for the better. They may change for an increased role for nuclear weapons in something like this. So Chris had mentioned that the nuclear arsenal he thinks is larger than it needs to be. I would agree, and I'd like to get my little historical vignette here in amongst the two historians and take you back to the 1960s and Robert McNamara. So McNamara decided that because there was this rivalry between the Air Force and the Navy, and nuclear weapons budgets were going up, that OSD needed to assert a criteria for how many were enough. Okay, how would you figure this out? And so McNamara decides that the assured destruction of the Soviet Union means we need the ability to destroy between 20 and 25% of the Soviet population, a quarter of the Soviet population, and half of its industrial capacity. Right? This is the early 1960s. So at the time, McNamara calculated that this would take 400 1-megaton nuclear warheads. 400. At the time, the United States had 18,000 megatons in its arsenal. So history shows that the requirements setting process actually is deeply troubled and comes to be completely divorced from requirements and takes on a life of its own. And so in terms of requirements in the NPR, I would actually bring this back to the president and lay it squarely at his feet and say, you have a responsibility to question the requirements that you're told are necessary for the nuclear arsenal. I mean, the military bureaucracy, NNSA, some people in OSD, they're all going to have a tendency to offer up a set of options that support status quo assumptions about nuclear weapons and deterrence. I mean, anybody who's worked in a bureaucracy knows that they're not particularly innovative and they tend to change pretty slowly over time. But it's up to the president to remember that the bureaucracy provides options, not requirements. So what does it take to deter Russia, China, any other adversary? Well, we can disagree about that, right? Thus, the bureaucracy isn't giving the president requirements for deterrence. The bureaucracy is providing opinions about how to pursue deterrence. The requirements come from the president. They come in the form of guidance for nuclear strategy and targeting. And so if you want to change nuclear policy, and if you want a policy that's responsive to the wishes of the public and not the bureaucracy, then it's the president's responsibility to embrace his role in setting requirements. And just for two sets of requirements, I would encourage President Biden to embrace. So one's what's required to match force structure to political objectives, not military requirements, right? So what does it take to hold a target at risk? This means making choices about which weapons, how many, performance characteristics, the degree to which the triad is necessary redundancy versus unnecessary duplication. And so rather than taking the options the bureaucracy presents, the president should pry open those relationships and not just accept the simple, small variation in the options that he's likely to be presented with. But a second set of requirements actually relates to deterrence and also this current situation. Nobody knows for certain what it takes to deter China or Russia. So every policy is in some instance a guess. But that guess assumes that leaders can rationally weigh the costs and benefits of their actions. But anyone who's involved in a crisis understands that this is a really unrealistic assumption. Just pick up the newspapers today. The notion that crises decision-making is irrational is backed up by a vast literature in academia from foreign policy, behavioral economics, psychology, all over the place. It says that especially in a crisis when the stakes are high, when information is uncertain, or when it's missing, or when time is short, people make really stupid decisions. So given that in a nuclear crisis, Joe Biden would have less than 15 minutes to make a decision, and a decision with unimaginably profound consequences, he should really examine the requirements for deterrence and the requirements and how they meet the expectations of rational decision-making, and to explain whether he believes he can meet those expectations, whether Putin will interpret those expectations, or whether any adversary can do that.
Right. There's a lot there. I actually now want to bring in an audience question from Matthias Schwartz and leverage Chris's military background here. Because what Matthias is asking about is the likelihood of Russia using a tactical nuke. Now, broadening that question out a little bit, this kind of ties into the integrated deterrence that Joe and Sharon have been talking about, which is the kind of fusion of conventional, creating a continuous spectrum between conventional capability and nuclear capability. No longer is there a sharp red line between the two. It seems to me tactical nukes are a great example of that. They've been being deployed by many countries. The US has a few hundred as well. So how do you position tactical nukes in US strategy, and what should we do about them?
So can I disagree a little bit with the premise that integrated deterrence is mostly about military responses and the blending or the mixing of conventional and nuclear? That certainly could be part of it. But and let's admit that this concept is still sort of being developed. But I see integrated deterrence as Secretary Austin or others in the Biden administration have articulated it, is about the other instruments of American power that we can use to threaten to deter action. Now, again, we can look at the use of these threats leading up to the Ukraine crisis and conclude, tragically, especially for the people of Ukraine, that those threats were not sufficient to deter Vladimir Putin from invading. So the threat of imposing the sanctions that have subsequently been imposed. But with respect to sort of, I see the role of tactical weapons in the current crisis as part of that escalatory ladder. Right now that we are in a crisis, and now that the tit for tat is playing out before us, I would like to believe that the use of nuclear weapons is far, far removed from where we would escalate to next. And again, why I still think the use is low, but not zero. And so, but if the United States or other nuclear weapon states develop capabilities that make it more likely that nuclear weapons be used in a crisis, then moving them down that escalatory ladder, I think, is extremely, extremely dangerous. And can I say one other thing? And I really want to echo something that Sharon said, is this talk of requirements, what is required to deter, is, as she points out, really problematic, right? We just do not know what increment of pressure or the seriousness of threat is likely to cause an adversary not to do something. One of the great mysteries of deterrence is you know only when it fails. Even when it succeeds, you can't prove that that particular threat is what caused the other party not to do the thing that you didn't want him or her to do. And so I really want to echo what Sharon said, because the word requirements is thrown away way too freely in Washington, D.C. with respect to military policy, not just nuclear weapons. These are, as she correctly points out, these are a range of options, a range of choices that you make available to the president and senior national security officials, but that does not mean that they are cast down from on high, like the 10 commandments on the tablet. So I really wanted to echo something that she said before.
That's great. Thanks for those clarifications, Chris. I want to bring in another audience question. This is from Parth Satam, who actually brings up the issue of no first use as a way to reduce risk. Now, Joe, in your brief, you talked about that. This was one of your recommendations. You also talked about another policy element known as sole purpose. That is a variation or in some form an approximation of NFU. But tell us more about no first use and sole purpose. What should the president do about these? Have these become even more imperative in the current crisis?
One of the reasons that I went back into the history in this issue brief was to talk about how we originally thought of these weapons and remind us how this looked even in the darkest days of World War II, in the early days of the Cold War. We never thought originally that we were ever going to use these weapons. They were too horrific, and Truman did use 2 of them, but he didn't actually issue the order to use them. History shows that these weapons were under the control of the military, and the military had gotten used to killing large numbers of innocent men, women, and children a long time ago in this war. And so they just moved right ahead for what they thought were sound strategic reasons to use this larger bomb. And they talk about a blurring of distinctions in weapons, and they killed it. And Truman didn't stop them from doing that. But when he learned that a 3rd city was going to be targeted, that's where he intervened. And according to his advisors, he just couldn't stand the thought of killing another 100,000 innocent men, women, and children. His quote was, I don't want to kill any more kids. Right. And that sort of stopped that use. But still, we thought this was going to be a deterrent, not a usable nuclear weapon. Well, here we are, 77 years later, and we've had nuclear weapons developed for all kinds of military purposes. We went nuclear nuts in the 50s and 60s and had landmines and torpedoes and depth charges and air defense systems, all kinds of things with nuclear weapons. We ratcheted back, and what we're seeing now, especially with this integrated deterrence, and I agree with Chris, that was the origins of it. It was an attempt to sort of minimize and say, look, our military options are just part of our deterrence. But the bureaucracy, as Sharon knows, is very skilled to take in an idea and not stopping it, but just redefining it as it works its way during the bureaucracy. And you say, yeah, economics, diplomacy, yeah, but look at the role that nukes can play here. And you embed it in the concept until it's enshrined. And that's what we have now with more usable nuclear weapons, low-yield nuclear weapons on our submarines. Trump ordered those. A new sea-launched cruise missiles, which even the Navy doesn't really want. Trump ordered those. New air-launched cruise missiles, things that can make the weapons more usable for military purposes. Except the United States is the country, we have the least reason for using nuclear weapons of any country in the world. Our conventional weapons can answer any conceivable military mission. except obliterating cities. And so we need to, as Chris says, we need to rethink all this. Let's go back to first principles. If we need these still for deterrence, how many? 100, 200, 300? Certainly not 5,500, which is what we now have. How can we get lower on this? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Sharon, I want to take advantage of your background in organizational politics and bureaucracies and how they act to obstruct, in many cases, prevent change. But I wonder, because bureaucracies, of course, have a lot of expertise in them. These are people that are very smart and very well trained, and there are many of them. So speak a little bit to the creative potential of bureaucracies. Do you see that as being potentially creative or enabling, or are they always an obstructionist, sort of a hard to change sort of an entity?
So I think Joe's answer, the conversation he just had, actually provides the answer. How did we get from Truman saying, I don't want to kill any more kids, to a nuclear arsenal that is focused on nuclear war fighting and doing the thing that the military is supposed to do as experts, right? So they took this weapon and they interpreted it as they're supposed to, as their organizational expertise. And so now we don't have nuclear weapons that are weapons of last resort or for existential deterrence. We have nuclear weapons that are integrated with conventional strike packages and vice versa, and which scare us all into thinking that there's a slippery slope where we might end up thinking we could control a limited nuclear use, because that's what planners would do, right? If you have a military problem and you have this suite of weapons, well, of course you plan for using the weapons you have in a variety of different ways. That's just smart expertise, right? It's the role of the president to come in and say, this is not what I want. And to draw sharp lines between nuclear and conventional use, nuclear and conventional planning, and to insert himself into this debate about whether or not nuclear weapons are good for war fighting or simply protecting the United States from existential threats. And as Joe suggests, allowing our very capable conventional military to do the rest. Because if you don't make that sharp line between conventional and nuclear use, you are acknowledging that you are willing to run the risk of uncontrolled escalation and the slippery slope between conventional and nuclear use. So this is why actually I think sole purpose is nice, no first use is nice, but I would go further and say the role of nuclear weapons are for the existential defense of the United States. Everything else is covered by a different military tool or economic or diplomatic, something else. And if the president's not willing to make that argument, then the president needs to explain exactly how he's going to control escalation.
Right. I'm going to turn to a question from Elizabeth Block, who talks about small countries acquiring nuclear weapons. And this gets us to the question of proliferation. They're going a little bit outside the U.S. Policy and U.S. Russia crisis now for a moment. I want to ask you, Chris, about this non-proliferation regime, because it is a strange regime. There are two big treaties that are the 5 permanent members who are legally allowed to have weapons. And then we have 4 other countries with nuclear weapons with varying levels of acceptance, Israel, North Korea, India, and Pakistan. So how do we, first of all, should non-proliferation even be a core and driving objective of U.S. grand strategy? And second, how would you design a non-proliferation order that's more consistent?
Well, I think, first of all, it is certainly in the United States' interest for there to be, I think, fewer rather than more nuclear weapon states. The question is, how do you go about doing that? And I remember one of the very first times that Joe and I ever even met, he may not even remember this, was if you're planning to remove a country's capacity for developing a nuclear weapon by force, then you're introducing a whole new set of rationales for why we use force in the first place. I'm talking about the war in Iraq and similar claims made with respect to the war in, the possibility of military action against Iran. So I think we should be very wary of elevating nuclear nonproliferation to such a level that we would be willing to undertake anything up to and including a war to separate countries from their weapons. Then the question becomes, well, what other reasons might countries have for developing nuclear weapons? This is one of the great ironies is that precisely by attacking Iraq or many years later, a country like Libya, you give countries a reason for wanting nuclear weapons in the first place as a deterrent against those sorts of regime change wars. So I think we just need to be very clear on where the role of nonproliferation, how the United States should go about doing that. The other complication, I'll just put it on the table, and I'm curious to hear what Joe and Sharon think about this, is one of the reasons why countries choose not to develop nuclear weapons is because they perceive that the United States has them covered, right? Either literally under the nuclear umbrella, figuratively under the nuclear umbrella, or under the range of conventional military tools the United States has. And I think we could certainly identify a number of US allies and partners who might have chosen to go down the road of acquiring nuclear weapons somewhere along the last 70 years or so, if they were not confident that the United States had their backs. And I think we need to think through what a no first use or a sole use policy would do. I still would come down on a sole use policy. That's where I would come down. But I do think we need to think about the role of no first use or sole use with respect to non-proliferation among US allies and partners. But I'd love to hear from Joe and Sharon on that.
Yeah, please take it away, Joe and Sharon, on this question, and also the question of extended deterrence generally.
Let me just talk about the non-proliferation part of this real quick.
Please.
It isn't like we had to invent new strategies. One of the things about policy is it leaves a track record. You can go back and you can go look at what policies were promised, what they expected to have happen from those, and then what actually happened, and judge their success. And over the years, the United States has remarkably successful policies on reducing nuclear risks. We used to have 66,000 nuclear weapons in the world in the mid 80s. We're down to 13. Remarkable success. John F. Kennedy worried about 25, 30 countries that might develop nuclear weapons, including Switzerland and Australia, not just our foes. And we developed this really successful set of policies that shrank it down basically to two: North Korea, which went ahead and crossed the nuclear threshold, and Iran, which is building up capability. But that's pretty much it in the world for the immediate proliferation threats. But we still have this tendency that countries might go back, like Japan, for example, or Taiwan or South Korea, and develop nuclear weapons if they feel that they need them for their defense. So let's go back and revisit those policies. That's what worked then. And these were policies crafted by Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. We had a unified American approach to this that saw that you had to reduce the existing arsenals in order to create the conditions where you could convince other countries not to get nuclear weapons. And you had to convince other countries not to get those nuclear weapons in order to create the conditions where people would feel comfortable reducing the arsenal. So non-proliferation and disarmament are two sides of the same coin. We stopped doing it. We stopped the disarmament part. Nuclear forces in the world are stuck at this current level and are starting to tick up. And if you think that's going to tick up alone, you haven't studied history. You have to get back to basic principles and understand the interrelationship of what we do and how it affects other countries.
Sharon?
So let me go back first to the question of extended deterrence and then come back and make a brief comment about proliferation. So extended deterrence is about signaling to your allies that you have a relationship and about identifying a sphere of influence. It's about clarifying intent, the depth of your commitment. All of that is well and good. The problem is that when you use nuclear weapons to do this, this increases the cost for everybody involved, right? So a nuclear umbrella over an ally makes them a nuclear target when it otherwise would probably not be a nuclear target. For example, Cold War Germany. The US had thousands of nuclear weapons there. Had there been a conflict with the Soviet Union, it's widely understood that Germany would cease to exist. Without the nuclear weapons, the outcomes may not have been what we wanted, but Germany likely would have survived to try something different another day. So similarly, extending a nuclear umbrella makes the US a nuclear target in a conflict where it might not otherwise be a nuclear target. I would also argue that this nuclear umbrella as the basis for extended deterrence actually makes alliance relationships more difficult. So the ability to control escalation inherently makes extended nuclear deterrence a problem of credibility. I mean, some people will remember the old "would you trade," Bonn for New York City for Bonn, or more contemporary example of DC for Seoul or Tokyo. Name your pair of states, right? But regardless of US efforts to reinforce its commitment with nuclear weapons and extended deterrence, there's always going to be doubt. And this doubt creates a space between allies when there's actually a need for constant reassurance. It also creates opportunities, quite frankly, for allies to coerce concessions on other issues, because you can never satisfy that deterrence is 100% sure, right? But it also gives adversaries an opportunity to exploit this credibility gap, that they're going to try and exploit the lack of credibility inherent in that relationship and turn it into a deeper sense of mistrust between people who would otherwise be allies. So if you remove the destructive capabilities of nuclear weapons from the equation, and thus the threat of escalation and the credibility problems, you don't solve the disagreements in the world. You don't solve the commitment problems. You don't solve the other things that make alliance relationships difficult, but you do remove the worst consequences if something goes wrong. The last thing I would say, going back to Joe's comment about disarmament and proliferation, one of the things that I would like to see the NPR do, which I think is going to be a cause of proliferation, is stop the process of expanding the US capability to make new and better nuclear weapons. The US is going to invest tens of billions of dollars in creating capacity to make new pits, to enrich uranium, to do a whole variety of different things, which to the rest of the world may look like we're interested in creating the capacity to someday build up as opposed to build down. I think that's a problem for proliferation.
Right. And if we're doing it, why shouldn't they do it?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Joe, I want you to have the last word, given that we have 2 minutes left. And I want to get to one of your recommendations in the brief, which was about on proliferation. You also raised a concern about this new military pact between the US, UK, and Australia, known as AUKUS. And you raised a concern about that as a proliferation risk. Tell us a little bit as to why we should be concerned.
Yeah, just since this is the last word, let me just thank you for having this panel, Sarang, and thank you, Sharon and Chris. This has been an exceptionally thoughtful discussion. Very, very, very rich. I appreciate all your work, and as you can see, I incorporated it and learned from it in the issue brief. On AUKUS, this is another throwback, unfortunately. The US policy clock is going back. It's going backwards. We're forgetting what worked, and we're going back to these sort of Cold War policies. Henry Kissinger was very concerned about the spread of civilian technologies. I mean, when Johnson started the negotiations for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the pillar of the Non-Proliferation regime, he couldn't finish the job. Nixon did. We implemented the Non-Proliferation Treaty, probably the most successful nuclear pact in history. But Kissinger saw that part of the deal was that countries would give up nuclear weapons, but they should be allowed to have nuclear technology for civilian uses. But he realized we needed a mechanism to control the spread of these technologies, to limit the spread of these technologies. Because centrifuges that can enrich fuel for fuel rods can also enrich fuel for the core of nuclear bombs. This is the issue we have for Iran. So you've got to have a mechanism for regulating that. What the AUKUS deal does is the Australian, UK, US deal is it not only does it sells new nuclear powered submarines to Australia, but those reactors are fueled by highly enriched uranium. And so to do that, Australia is going to, and they're talking about this, create the capacity to make highly enriched uranium for those reactors. That makes Australia a proliferation risk. Why are we doing that? If you want to go ahead and increase Australia's defense capabilities, fine, but do it in a way that doesn't increase the nuclear risks. There are other mechanisms. For example, you can go back to France and do the diesel-powered subs, which are quite close in capability. You could develop reactors that go on low-enriched uranium. So when you, this is a danger that many nuclear weapons policy experts are warning about. In our zeal to look tough, in our zeal to contain China, we're going back on policies that have worked, and we're undermining our own best interests. We're participating in the spread of this dangerous nuclear technology around the world. That's going to come back to bite us.
Right, and that today the news is all about Russia, but we at the Quincy Institute have not taken our eyes off the ball in terms of what's happening in Asia. And we will be having panels on the sorts of questions that Joe just talked about AUKUS and the Indo-Pacific strategy. But today, we have to stop because it's been 1 hour. It's been a fantastic discussion. I've just been sitting here listening and learning so much. And I want to end by thanking all of you, Chris, Sharon, and Joe. And again, hold up this brief, read this brief, download this brief, you'll have fun. So thanks a lot to everybody, and thanks to the audience for participating today.